The northern battlefield was stained with blood, but the royal chamber smelled only of bitter herbs and fading breath. Arthur, a man who had crushed kingdoms with a single command, knelt on the cold stone floor. His massive hands, scarred by iron and war, held something absurd against his dark armor: 2 fragile wooden needles and a half-finished gray blanket. As his mother's pulse flickered and died, he made a silent, desperate vow. The rebellion was rising, and his court was filled with vipers, but the king did not care for power. He had to mend what she couldn't finish. He had to learn to stitch, even if it meant breaking his own cold heart to do it. Arthur kicked his boots out of the stirrups before his horse came to a full stop. He dropped heavily onto the wet cobblestones. His chainmail rattled loud enough to startle the nearby stable boys. He tossed the thick leather reins to a waiting guard. Nobody cheered his return. The courtyard was filled with soldiers, but silence hung heavy in the damp air. They all knew why he had ridden ahead of his victorious army. Arthur walked toward the central keep. He did not bother removing his armor. Blood from the Northern Rebellion still stained his iron gauntlets. He climbed the spiral stairs leading to the royal chambers. His long legs took the stone steps 2 at a time. He shoved past a group of whispering physicians in the corridor. They scattered like frightened birds. Arthur grabbed the brass handle of his mother's door. He paused for a fraction of a second. He took a shallow breath. Then he pushed the heavy wood open. The chamber was suffocatingly warm. A massive fire blazed in the stone hearth. Heavy tapestries covered the windows to keep the winter wind out. The room smelled of bitter herbs and impending death. Arthur walked slowly toward the wooden bed. His mother lay beneath a mountain of furs. She looked incredibly small. He remembered her as a force of nature. Now she was just fragile bones wrapped in pale skin. Arthur pulled off his heavy gauntlets. He dropped them onto the floorboards. The metal clattered sharply in the quiet room. His mother opened her eyes. Her gaze found him through the dim light. A faint smile cracked her dry lips. "You made it back," she whispered. Her voice was nothing more than a raspy sigh. Arthur knelt on the stone floor beside her bed. He took her thin hand in his scarred one. "I am here, Mother." He felt the terrible coldness of her skin. The roaring fire in the room was doing no good. She pulled her hand away gently. She reached toward her chest. Arthur noticed the wooden knitting needles for the first time. Thick gray yarn was tangled around her knobby fingers. A half-finished blanket rested on her stomach. The stitches were uneven and clumsy. His mother had never been skilled at needlework. She had spent her life managing a kingdom and surviving assassins. "I wanted to finish it before the snow fell," she said. Her breathing grew shallow. "The northern winters are so unforgiving." Arthur felt a strange pressure in his throat. He swallowed hard against it. "You can finish it when you are stronger." He hated the lie as soon as it left his mouth. She knew the truth. She always knew when he lied. "My hands refuse to listen to me anymore," she murmured. She stared down at the gray wool. Tears pooled in the corners of her cloudy eyes. "It is just a blanket, Mother." Arthur tried to keep his voice steady. "You have given me enough to keep me warm." She slowly shook her head. "This was supposed to be just from me. Not from the Queen, but from your mother." She tried to lift the wooden needles again. Her fingers trembled violently. One needle slipped from her grasp. It rolled down the furs and stopped against Arthur's knee. He picked it up. The wood was smooth and warm from her touch. She let out a long, ragged exhale. Her eyes fluttered shut. "Mother?" Arthur leaned closer. He waited for the next rise of her chest. It never came. The silence in the room deepened. The fire crackled in the hearth. Arthur stayed on his knees. He stared at her peaceful face. He did not weep. He had forgotten how to cry a long time ago. He reached out and gently took the other needle from her lifeless hand. He gathered the loose gray yarn. He placed the unfinished blanket carefully on his lap. The wool smelled like her lavender soap. He looked at the rough, uneven stitches. Arthur had commanded armies and destroyed empires. He knew how to swing a broadsword and break a siege. He looked down at the delicate wooden sticks in his massive hands. He had no idea what to do with them. He sat by the bed for hours. The fire slowly burned down to embers. The room grew bitterly cold. Arthur did not move. He just held the unfinished blanket. He traced his thumb over the last stitch she had made. The yarn was unraveling at the edge. He watched a small loop pull loose. He clumsily tried to push the wooden needle through the wool to stop it. He only made it worse. Another loop fell away. Arthur felt a sudden surge of panic. He was losing the last thing she had touched. He gripped the needles tighter. He would not let it unravel. He would not let this piece of her disappear. He carefully set the knitting on the chair next to the bed. He stood up. His knees ached from the hard stone. He looked at his mother one last time. He pulled the furs up to her chin. "Rest now," he whispered. Arthur turned and walked toward the door. He did not look back. He opened the door to find the physicians waiting outside. "The Queen Mother is gone," Arthur told them. The men bowed their heads in immediate silence. Arthur stared right through them. "Find me a weaver," he ordered. The men looked at each other in confusion. "A weaver, Your Grace?" Arthur's voice hardened into steel. "Find someone who knows how to work with yarn and needles. Bring them to my study immediately." The men scrambled down the hallway to obey. Arthur walked back to his quarters. He carried the half-finished blanket against his chest. It looked ridiculous against his blood-stained armor. He did not care. He had made a silent promise in that room. The northern winds would not touch him this winter. His mother's final gift would be completed, even if he had to learn how to stitch it himself. Arthur paced the length of his private study. The heavy oak floorboards groaned under his weight. He had finally removed his bloodied chainmail. He now wore a simple linen tunic and dark trousers. The roaring fire in the stone hearth cast long shadows against the walls. He placed the unfinished blanket on the center of his heavy wooden desk. He stared at the tangled gray wool. The two wooden needles looked like fragile twigs. A sharp knock echoed through the heavy oak door. Arthur stopped pacing immediately. "Enter," he commanded. The heavy door creaked open. Two armored guards stepped into the room. They roughly pushed a small figure forward. Arthur frowned. He had expected the master of the royal wardrobe. He had expected an older woman with decades of fine experience. Instead, he saw a young woman dressed in coarse gray rags. She stumbled forward and caught herself on the edge of a heavy chair. Her right leg twisted at an unnatural angle. She kept her head bowed. Her matted brown hair fell forward to hide her face. She was shivering violently in the warm room. She looked like a cornered animal waiting for the final blow. "Who is this?" Arthur asked. His voice was low and flat. One of the nards stepped forward and bowed nervously. "We could not find the master weaver, my lord. He fled the castle when the northern rebellion started. This is Ilara. We found her in the lower kitchens repairing the servants' winter cloaks. They say she knows how to handle wool." Arthur looked down at the trembling girl. She did not look up. She kept her thin arms wrapped around her small torso. She looked terribly frail against the dark stone of his study. "Leave us," Arthur ordered. The guards hesitated near the doorway. "She is a rat from the lower levels, sire." "Leave us," Arthur repeated. The guards nodded quickly and backed out of the room. The heavy door clicked shut behind them. The silence in the room stretched out. The girl continued to tremble. Arthur walked slowly around his desk. He stopped a few feet away from her. "Look at me," he said. Ilara slowly raised her head. Her face was smeared with ash from the kitchen fires. Her hands were covered in red chilblains and small white scars. Her eyes were wide and terrified. They were a pale, striking shade of blue. "Do you know who I am?" Arthur asked. "You are the king," she whispered. Her voice shook over the syllables. Arthur pointed to the gray bundle on his desk. "Come here." Ilara dragged her crippled leg across the floorboards. The scraping sound echoed loudly in the quiet room. She stopped beside the heavy oak desk. "Look at this," Arthur commanded. Ilara looked down at the unfinished blanket. She saw the tangled edges. She saw the clumsy, uneven stitches of the gray yarn. "Can you fix this?" Arthur asked. Ilara stared at the wool for a long time. She reached out with a trembling hand. She stopped before her fingers touched the gray yarn. She looked up at him in sudden fear. "Touch it," he said. She gently picked up the trailing end of the yarn. Her dirty, calloused fingers moved lightly over the stitches. She traced the uneven line of the work. "Someone dropped a stitch right here," she said softly. Her voice was barely louder than the crackling fire. "The tension is all wrong. The wool is unraveling rapidly from the left side. Can you teach me how to stop it?" Arthur asked. Ilara froze. She looked up at his face. She saw the harsh lines of his jaw and the coldness in his dark eyes. "You want to learn how to knit?" she asked. Arthur did not blink. "I want to finish this blanket." Ilara looked back down at the uneven wool. She recognized the clumsy work of darning hands. She had seen the same desperate stitches in the freezing slums. She saw and understood what this ugly piece of fabric meant to the man standing before her. The terror slowly left her blue eyes. It was replaced by a quiet sorrow. "Sit down," she said. Arthur raised an eyebrow. Nobody commanded the king to sit. Ilara did not seem to notice his hesitation. She pulled up a heavy wooden stool. She sat down carefully to protect her twisted leg. She picked up the 2 wooden needles. Arthur sat down slowly in his high-backed leather chair. He watched her small hands. "Hold out your hands," she instructed. Arthur held out his scarred hands. His knuckles were thick from years of sword training. His palms were covered in hardened calluses. Ilara gently placed 1 wooden needle in his right hand. She placed the other in his left. "You are holding them like daggers," she said. Her voice was suddenly calm and steady. Arthur loosened his grip immediately. "You must hold them lightly," she explained. She reached out and adjusted his fingers. Her touch was surprisingly warm against his cold skin. Her small hands easily guided his thick fingers into the proper place. "You need to guide the yarn, not strangle it." She picked up the trailing end of the gray wool. She looped it delicately over his index finger. Arthur felt completely ridiculous. He could crush a man's throat with 1 hand. Now he was sweating over a thin wooden stick. "Watch carefully," Ilara said. She leaned closer to the desk. She guided his right hand forward. "Push the tip of the needle through this front loop." Arthur tried to push the needle. The wood caught firmly on the tight wool. He pushed harder. The needle slipped and nearly stabbed his other hand. He let out a frustrated breath. This is impossible. Alara shook her head. You are fighting the yarn. She placed her small hands directly over his. Let the needle do the work. She guided his hands slowly. The wooden tip slid perfectly through the gray loop. Now wrap the yarn around the back, she whispered. Arthur moved his finger. The yarn slipped smoothly over the wood. Pull it through, she said. Arthur carefully pulled the needle back toward himself. A new loop formed perfectly on the right needle. He let out a slow breath. You did it, Alara said softly. She slowly pulled her hands away. Arthur stared at the single new stitch. It looked incredibly tight and angry. It did not match the loose, clumsy stitches of his mother. It is too tight, he said. Alara nodded. You are holding too much tension in your shoulders. You knit the way you prepare for a battle. Arthur looked at the small girl in rags. She was the first person to speak to him without flinching in years. She did not see a warlord who had just slaughtered an army. She only saw a terrible student ruining a piece of wool. I do not know any other way, Arthur said. Alara picked up a spare piece of yarn from the table. Then you must learn a new way, she replied. She wrapped the yarn around her own scarred fingers. She began to knit a scrap of nothing. Her movements were incredibly fast and fluid. The wooden needles clicked softly together in a rhythmic dance. Follow my rhythm, she said. Arthur watched her small hands move. He gripped his wooden needles again. He pushed the tip into the next loop. The wood caught again. He forced himself to relax his tight jaw. He wrapped the yarn around the back of the needle. He pulled it through carefully. The needle clicked softly against the other. The sound was strange in the quiet study. It was the sound of creation, not destruction. Arthur moved to the next loop. He pushed the needle through. He wrapped the yarn. He pulled it through. Click! The massive fire burned lower in the stone hearth. The castle outside grew dark and completely silent. The king and the crippled orphan sat together in the shadows. They did not speak again. The only sound was the quiet clicking of wooden needles. Arthur made another clumsy stitch. He was a long way from the blood and mud of the northern battlefield. He felt a strange, quiet peace settle over his heavy heart. The iron clock in the courtyard chimed 3 times. Winter wind battered the thick glass of the study windows. Arthur kept his eyes locked on the wooden needles. His back ached from leaning over the desk for so many hours. He had managed to complete 3 rows of gray stitches. They were still far tighter than his mother's loose loops. He paused to wipe a drop of sweat from his forehead. Knitting required a different kind of endurance than wielding a sword. Alara sat silently on her wooden stool. Her chin rested against her chest. Exhaustion had finally overtaken her fear. Arthur watched her slow, shallow breathing. She was still shivering beneath her thin rags. The stone hearth had lost most of its heat hours ago. He set the blanket down on the smooth oak desk. Arthur stood up and stretched his stiff shoulders. He walked over to a heavy iron hook near the door. A massive black bearskin cloak hung from the metal prong. He pulled it down. The heavy fur weighed almost as much as a chainmail shirt. He carried it back to the center of the room. Alara flinched when his shadow fell over her. She woke up instantly. Panic flashed across her pale blue eyes. I am sorry, she gasped. She tried to stand up on her twisted leg. Arthur placed a heavy hand on her thin shoulder. He pressed her gently back down onto the stool. Do not move, he commanded.
He swung the massive fur cloak over her trembling shoulders. The heavy material swallowed her frail frame entirely. The thick furs fell all the way to the wooden floorboards.
Ilara stared up at him in pure shock. Nobody had ever offered her warmth before. The heavy bearskin smelled of pine needles and old leather. "It is too much, my lord." She tried to push the heavy folds away from her chest. "I am just a servant." Arthur ignored her protest. He pulled the thick edges together beneath her chin. "You are freezing," he stated. "A dead teacher cannot show me how to turn the corner of this blanket." Ilara stopped struggling against the heavy garment. A tiny, unexpected smile touched the corners of her mouth. Arthur turned away to hide his own surprise. He walked to the heavy oak door and opened it. A tired guard stood at attention in the dark corridor. "Bring hot stew and bread from the kitchens," Arthur ordered. The guard blinked in confusion. "The kitchens are sealed for the night, sire." Arthur lowered his voice to a dangerous rumble. "Wake the cooks and break the seal." He did not wait for a response before slamming the door shut. He walked back to his desk and sat down. He picked up the wooden needles once again. "Show me how to fix a draught stitch," he said. Ilara pulled her arms out from beneath the dark fur. She leaned forward and pointed at a loose loop in the gray yarn. "You must catch it before it unravels further down." She guided his thick fingers with practiced patience. Her hands were no longer shaking like autumn leaves. The thick fur cloak had chased the deadly chill from her bones. They worked in quiet concentration for another hour. A timid knock finally interrupted their silence. The door opened to reveal a nervous servant carrying a silver tray. He placed it quickly on the edge of the large desk. The man bowed low and hurried out of the room. Thick steam rose from a deep iron bowl. The rich smell of roasted meat and root vegetables filled the study. A crusty loaf of bread sat beside the bowl. Arthur pushed the silver tray toward Ilara. "Eat," he commanded. Ilara stared at the hot food. She had not eaten a proper meal in 3 days. The lower servants survived on watery oats and stale crust. She slowly reached for the wooden spoon. Her stomach growled loudly in the quiet room. She dipped the spoon into the thick, dark broth. She lifted it halfway to her mouth. Then she stopped. She looked across the desk at Arthur. He was still wrestling with a difficult stitch. "You have been writing since dawn," she said softly. Arthur did not look up from his work. "I am fine." Ilara carefully pushed the silver tray to the center of the desk. She tore the warm bread into 2 equal halves. She placed the larger piece near his scarred hand. "You cannot learn to knit if you faint from hunger." Arthur finally looked up. He stared at the piece of bread on the dark wood. He looked at the peasant girl wearing his massive cloak. She was practically starving. She belonged to the lowest caste of his entire kingdom. Yet she was offering him half of her first real meal. Kings were surrounded by people who only wanted to take. Nobles begged for lands and Nechans pleaded for gold. This crippled girl had nothing to give but a piece of bread. She offered it without a second thought. Arthur slowly reached out and took the warm crust. "Thank you," he said. The word felt strange and foreign on his tongue. He broke off a small piece and placed it in his mouth. Ilara finally took a sip of the hot broth. She closed her eyes in pure relief. The warm food brought a faint flush of color to her pale cheeks. They shared the simple meal in absolute silence. The heavy iron door suddenly swung open without a knock. Lord Malachor stepped into the quiet study. He wore expensive velvet robes lined with silver fox fur. He was Arthur's chief advisor and the wealthiest man in the capital. Malachor stopped abruptly when he saw the scene before him. His sharp eyes darted from the unfinished blanket to the silver tray. They finally rested on the crippled girl wearing the king's personal cloak. Disgust twisted his narrow face. "What is the meaning of this?" Malachor demanded. Arthur did not stand up. He simply rested his hands on the heavy desk. "You forget to knock, Malachor." The advisor waved a hand dismissively. "We have a kingdom to secure, sire. The northern lords are demanding terms of surrender. We must draft the treaty before morning." Malachor pointed a long finger at Alara. "Why is this filthy creature sitting in your private chambers?" Alara shrank back into the heavy bearskin cloak. Her brief moment of safety evaporated instantly. She lowered her head and stared at the floorboards. Arthur stood up slowly. He seemed to fill the entire room. "She is helping me with a personal matter." Malachor sneered at the unfinished gray blanket. "You are playing with yarn while the realm bleeds. Throw this wretched beggar back to the cellars." Arthur walked around the edge of the desk. His footsteps were dangerously quiet. He stopped inches from his chief advisor. Malachor was a tall man. Arthur still towered over him like a mountain of stone. "This girl is my guest," Arthur said softly. His voice held the promise of sudden violence. "You will refer to her with respect." Malachor swallowed hard. The color drained from his arrogant face. He recognized the deadly calm in the king's eyes. It was the same look Arthur wore before ordering an execution. "My apologies, sire," Malachor stammered. "I merely meant to stress the urgency of our political situation." Arthur turned his head slightly. "Alara?" he called out softly. The girl flinched but looked up. "Does Lord Malachor's presence disturb your concentration?" Arthur asked. Alara stared at the terrifying monarch. She looked at the arrogant nobleman trembling before him. She gave a tiny, almost invisible nod. Arthur turned his cold gaze back to his advisor. "Leave us." Malachor opened his mouth to argue. He closed it just as quickly. He bowed stiffly and backed out of the room. He shut the heavy door firmly behind him. Arthur walked back to his chair and sat down. He picked up the wooden needles. "Where were we?" he asked calmly. Alara let out a breath she had been holding for a full minute. She looked at the fierce warrior across the desk. He had just humiliated the most powerful noble in the court for a kitchen maid. She reached over and adjusted his grip on the left needle. "You need to pull the yarn a little tighter on the turns," she said. Her voice was steady once again. Arthur nodded and followed her instruction. The wooden needles began their quiet clicking once more. Outside the thick stone walls, the winter storm raged on. Inside the study, a strange new alliance had been forged in wool and silence. 3 days passed since the long winter night. Arthur moved his command operations entirely into the private study. He refused to leave the unfinished blanket unattended for even an hour. Alara remained in the warm room by his direct order. She no longer slept on the freezing stone floors of the cellar. Arthur had commanded the guards to bring a small feather cot. He placed it directly near the massive stone hearth. He ensured she ate 3 hot meals every single day. Color slowly returned to her pale cheeks. The terrible shaking in her hands finally stopped. They spent hours working on the gray wool together in quiet harmony. Arthur was a remarkably slow and stubborn student. He still gripped the wooden needles far too tightly. Alara gently corrected his mistakes with infinite patience. She never mocked his clumsy attempts to master the simple loops. Arthur found himself looking forward to the quiet rhythm of their daily work. The heavy burden of his crown felt strangely lighter in the warm study. He watched how carefully she handled his mother's unfinished work. She treated the cheap gray wool like it was spun gold, but the outside world refused to wait for his grief to heal. A messenger arrived from the northern border on the 4th afternoon. The rebel leaders had rejected the initial peace terms. Arthur threw his wooden needle onto the desk in deep frustration. He rubbed his tired eyes and let out a heavy sigh. "I must meet with the War Council immediately," he said. Alara nodded and pulled the gray yarn toward her side of the desk. "I will fix the dropped stitches on the border while you are gone." Arthur stood up and strapped his heavy sword belt around his waist. "Do not let anyone inside this room." He left the study and locked the heavy oak door behind him. Alara enjoyed the sudden quiet of the empty chamber. She hummed a soft tune while her fingers danced over the wool. The blanket was nearly halfway finished now. It looked much better under her careful supervision. She carefully repaired the loose edges left by the dying queen. An hour passed in peaceful silence. Then the heavy iron handle turned with a loud mechanical click. Alara jumped slightly in her chair. Arthur had taken the only iron key with him. Only a master key held by the royal advisors could bypass that lock. The oak door swung open to reveal Lord Malachor. He wore a dark velvet doublet and a cruel, triumphant smile. 2 armed guards stood in the dark hallway behind him. Malachor stepped inside and closed the door firmly. He looked around the empty study before his eyes locked onto Alara. "So the king finally left his new pet alone?" he sneered. Alara clutched the gray wool tightly against her chest. "You are not supposed to be in here, my lord." Malachor laughed softly. His laughter sounded like dry leaves scraping against a tombstone. "I go wherever I please in this castle." He walked slowly toward the heavy oak desk. Alara tried to stand up to retreat. Her crippled leg gave out beneath her sudden panic. She stumbled and fell hard against the wooden floorboards. The wooden needles clattered loudly across the quiet room. Malachor looked down at her with absolute disgust. "You embarrassed me in front of my king." He took another deliberate step forward. A filthy kitchen rat made a noble lord look completely foolish. Alara scrambled backward until her shoulders hit the cold stone wall. "I did nothing to you," she whispered. Malachor kicked the heavy wooden stool out of his way. It crashed violently against the tall bookshelf. He noticed the gray yarn trailing across the floorboards. The unfinished blanket lay partially on the desk and partially on the floor. He reached down and picked up the delicate wool. "Arthur has lost his mind over this peasant garbage." "Please put that down," Alara begged. She reached out with a trembling hand to stop him. "It belongs to his dead mother." Malachor ignored her desperate warning. He wrapped the gray yarn around his heavy leather boot. Perhaps the king needs a harsh reminder of his true priorities. He pulled his leg back sharply. The rough movement tore 3 rows of fresh stitches completely apart. Alara let out a small cry of distress. She dragged herself forward and desperately grabbed his leather boot. "Stop it!" Malachor backhanded her fiercely across the face. The heavy silver rings on his fingers cut deeply into her cheek. Alara fell backward and tasted warm blood in her mouth. She held her face and stared up at him in sheer terror. Malachor raised his heavy boot to step directly on the wooden needles. He intended to snap the fragile tools in half. The oak door exploded inward without warning. It hit the stone wall with a deafening crash. The heavy wood splintered around the iron hinges. Arthur stood in the shattered doorway. He looked like a nightmare forged in steel and shadow. The War Council had ended earlier than expected. He saw Alara bleeding on the wooden floorboards. He saw Malachor's boot tangled in his mother's precious gray yarn. The air in the room instantly dropped 20 degrees. Malachor froze completely in his tracks. The cruel smirk vanished from his pale face. He slowly lowered his heavy boot. "Sire," he stammered nervously, "I was merely inspecting the room for internal security." Arthur did not say a single word. He stepped into the study and closed the distance. He drew his longsword in one fluid, terrifying motion. The steel ran a deadly note in the quiet room. Malachor raised his hands in blind panic. Arthur did not swing the sharp blade. He drove the heavy steel pommel directly into Malachor's face. Bones shattered loudly under the brutal impact. Malachor collapsed onto the floorboards like a broken puppet. He clutched his ruined nose and screamed in absolute agony. Arthur kicked the writhing noble squarely in the chest. The impact sent Malachor sliding rapidly across the room. He slammed hard against the stone fireplace. Arthur walked slowly toward his broken advisor. He raised the heavy sword to deliver a final blow. Alara grabbed the edge of Arthur's dark trousers. Her small hand was shaking violently against his leg. "Do not kill him," she pleaded. Arthur stopped immediately. He looked down at the bleeding girl. Her cheek was badly bruised and swollen from the strike. A thin line of blood ran down her pale chin. The sight of her injury fueled the dark rage burning in his chest. "He touched my mother's work," Arthur said softly. "He struck you in my own chambers." Alara tightened her grip on his dark trousers. "Blood in this room will ruin the wool forever." Arthur stared at her for a long moment. He looked at the unraveled yarn scattered across the messy floor. He slowly lowered the heavy steel sword. He turned his cold gaze back to the sobbing advisor. "Guards," Arthur roared. The two armored men rushed into the damaged room. They stared in pure horror at their bleeding commander. "Drag this piece of filth to the deep dungeons." The guards hauled Malachor to his feet without a second of hesitation. "Strip him of his royal titles and his ancestral lands." Arthur sheathed his sword with a sharp mechanical click. "If I see his face in my castle tomorrow, I will take his head." The guards dragged the moaning nobleman out of the ruined study. Arthur closed the broken door as best as he could. He turned his attention entirely back to Alara. She was trying to gather the unraveled gray yarn from the floor. Her hands were shaking too badly to hold the delicate strings. Arthur dropped to his knees on the hard wooden floorboards. He gently pushed her hands away from the ruined wool. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean linen cloth. He carefully wiped the blood from her bruised cheek. "I am sorry," he whispered. Alara looked up into his dark eyes. The cold warlord was completely gone. He looked genuinely devastated by her physical pain. "It is just a scratch," she said quietly. Arthur slowly shook his head. "Nobody will ever touch you again." He made the promise with absolute certainty. He gathered the loose yarn and the fallen wooden needles himself. He helped Alara stand up safely on her good leg. He guided her gently to the soft leather chair behind his desk. He placed the tangled blanket carefully in her lap. "We can fix the broken stitches together," he said. Alara nodded and picked up the wooden tools once again. Arthur pulled up the wooden stool and sat closely beside her. He did not return to the War Council that afternoon. He spent the rest of the evening watching her hands heal the damage. The splintered oak door remained shut for 3 full days. Arthur ordered his personal guards to block the hallway. Nobody from the court dared to approach the study. Rumors of the brutal banishment echoed through the stone corridors. Inside the room, the fire crackled warmly in the hearth. Alara sat in the leather chair with her injured leg resting on a velvet cushion. The swelling on her cheek had gone down significantly. A dark purple bruise covered the left side of her face. Arthur applied a cool herbal salve to her skin every morning. His thick fingers moved with surprising gentleness across her jaw. Alara did not flinch away from his touch anymore. She simply closed her eyes and let him work. The gray blanket grew steadily over her lap. They had repaired the damage caused by the heavy boot. Arthur managed to complete an entire row without dropping a single stitch. He looked proud of this minor accomplishment. Alara smiled when she inspected his tight, even work. "You learn fast when you stop fighting the yarn," she observed. Arthur grunted and set the wooden needles on the desk. He poured 2 cups of hot cider from an iron kettle. He handed 1 clay mug to Alara before sitting on the wooden stool. "My mother wanted me to be a builder," he said quietly. Alara paused her knitting to look at him. She took a slow sip of the sweet cider. Arthur stared into the roaring flames. She hated the endless wars on the borders. "She told me that a true ruler creates things that outlast his own life." He traced a deep scar on his left palm. "I only know how to tear things down. I burn cities and break armies." He looked at the soft gray wool in Alara's lap. "This is the first time I have created something with my own hands." Alara set her mug on the edge of the desk. She picked up the trailing end of the yarn. "You protected this room," she reminded him. "You kept the cold out. Building does not always mean stacking stones or laying timber. Sometimes it just means keeping a space safe for someone else." Arthur turned his head to study her face. The firelight caught the pale blue of her eyes. She did not look like a broken servant anymore. She carried a quiet dignity that demanded respect. Arthur realized he looked forward to her voice more than his general's reports. He needed her calm presence to anchor his restless mind. "I have spent my life surrounded by wolves," Arthur said. "My advisors smile while they plan to stab me in the back. My enemies wait for a single moment of weakness." He leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees. "You are the only person who does not want anything from me." Alara looked down at the wooden needles. She guided a new loop of wool over the smooth tip. "I want to finish this blanket," she replied softly. Arthur let out a rare, genuine laugh. The deep sound bounced off the stone walls. It startled Alara for a brief second. She had never heard him laugh before. It erased the harsh lines around his mouth. He looked 10 years younger in that fleeting moment. "I will make sure you have all the yarn you need," Arthur promised. They fell back into their comfortable silence. The rhythmic clicking of the needles marked the passing time. Arthur watched her small hands work the rough wool. He thought about the cold cellars where the guards had found her. He pictured her sleeping on wet stone floors. He imagined other nobles kicking her aside like dirt. A fierce protective instinct seized his chest. He would burn the castle to ashes before he let her return to the kitchens. The heavy door groaned as someone knocked carefully from the outside. Arthur stopped smiling immediately. His face hardened back into a mask of stone. "Enter," he commanded. The captain of the guard stepped into the room. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the floorboards. He did not dare look at the girl sitting in the king's chair. "The War Council requests your presence, sire," the captain said. "The northern lords have sent a second offer of surrender." Arthur picked up his wooden needles again. "Bring the parchment here," he ordered. The captain blinked in confusion. "Here, sire?" Arthur drove his needle through a loop of yarn. "I will not repeat myself, Captain." The captain bowed quickly and hurried out of the room. Alara watched Arthur with wide eyes. "You cannot hold a war council in here," she whispered. "I am holding it wherever I please," Arthur replied. He pulled the yarn through the stitch. "You told me to keep my tension steady. I cannot do that if I am shouting at foolish lords in the great hall." 5 minutes later, 3 senior generals filed into the study. They wore heavy armor and carried rolled maps. They stopped in utter shock when they saw their monarch. Arthur was sitting on a wooden stool, knitting a gray blanket. A bruised servant girl sat in his leather chair, wrapped in his personal cloak. "Read the terms," Arthur instructed without looking up. The oldest general cleared his throat nervously. He unrolled a crisp sheet of parchment. He read the list of demands from the northern rebels. They wanted lower taxes and control of the silver mines. They demanded amnesty for their leaders. Arthur finished his row of stitches. He set the needles down on the desk. "Reject it," he stated flatly. The generals exchanged worried glances. "They will march on the capital before spring," the old general warned. "Let them march," Arthur said. He stood up and faced his military commanders. "Tell them I accept unconditional surrender and nothing else. If they refuse, I will ride north and take their heads myself." His voice left no room for debate. The generals bowed and quickly left the room. Arthur sat back down and picked up his knitting. He looked over at Alara. She was staring at him in awe. He had just decided the fate of thousands while holding 2 wooden sticks. "Where did I drop the last stitch?" he asked calmly. Alara pointed a shaking finger at the center of the blanket. "Right there," she managed to say. They worked for another 3 hours until the sun set. Thick snow fell heavily across the inner courtyard outside the window. The northern winter had finally arrived in full force. "How many more rows until it is finished?" Arthur asked. Alara measured the length of the gray fabric against her chest. "Perhaps 20 rows," she answered. "We will finish it by tomorrow evening." Arthur nodded slowly. He turned his gaze toward the roaring fire. "Tomorrow evening," he repeated. A dangerous light flickered in his dark eyes. He walked to the heavy desk and picked up his own needles again. "Let us make these last rows perfect." Alara guided his hands through the next turn of the yarn. She did not notice the heavy burden settling on his broad shoulders. Arthur was no longer just knitting a blanket. He was planning a revolution. He followed her gentle instructions with deadly focus. Every stitch bound him closer to the fragile girl beside him. Every loop of gray wool sealed the fate of his arrogant court. He had finally found something worth building. He would start by building a throne for the lowest servant in his realm. The final loop of gray yarn slid smoothly off the wooden needle. Arthur exhaled a long breath. His broad shoulders dropped an inch. Alara handed him a pair of heavy iron shears from the desk. "Cut the trailing end," she instructed softly. Arthur squeezed the cold iron handles. The sharp blades severed the thick wool with a quiet snap. It was finished. He set the iron shears down beside the wooden needles. He picked up a heavy gray blanket with both hands. It was far from a masterpiece of royal weaving. The bottom half was loose and uneven from his dying mother's failing grip. The middle section was tight and aggressive from his early attempts. The top rows were perfect and even under Alara's careful guidance. It told the entire story of its creation in its crooked lines. Arthur ran his rough thumb over the final row. He felt a profound weight lift from his chest. The ghost of his mother could finally rest. He walked around the heavy oak desk. Alara watched him with quiet blue eyes. She expected him to fold the blanket and lock it in a wooden chest. Instead, Arthur draped the heavy wool gently over her shoulders. He arranged the fabric so it covered her thin arms completely. Alara froze in surprise. "This belongs to the Queen Mother," she whispered. Arthur stepped back and studied her in the firelight. "It belongs to the person who saved it," he replied. "My mother would have wanted the person who fixed her mistakes to stay warm." Alara pulled the soft gray wool closer to her neck.
It smelled like lavender soap and the sharp pine scent of Arthur's study. She had never owned anything new in her entire life. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. She blinked them away quickly. Servants were punished for showing uninvited emotion. "Thank you, Arthur," she said. She did not use his royal title. The omission felt natural in the quiet warmth of the room. Arthur got a single nod. He turned and walked toward the large stone window. He looked out at the frozen courtyard below.
The snow was falling in thick white sheets. The castle guards were huddled near the iron gates for warmth. "What will happen to me tomorrow?" Lilara asked behind him. Her voice trembled slightly. "The blanket is finished. I have no more use in this room." Arthur kept his eyes on the falling snow. "You will never return to the kitchens. You will never scrub another floor or wear another ragged dress." He turned to face her. "I am naming you a ward of the crown tomorrow morning." Ilara stared at him in disbelief. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Nobles would riot over such a declaration. A disabled servant could not simply become a royal ward. "They will never accept me," she finally managed to say. "They will mock you for keeping a crippled beggar in the high tower." Arthur's expression turned to solid stone. "Let them mock me. I will separate their heads from their shoulders." He walked back toward the fireplace. The heavy logs snapped and hissed in the flames. Arthur stopped abruptly. He tilted his head toward the heavy oak door. His battle-hardened instincts flared to life. The corridor outside was far too quiet. The 2 personal guards stationed at his door usually shuffled their heavy boots. They occasionally coughed in the dry winter air. Now there was only a hollow, dead silence. Arthur held up a hand. "Do not move," he commanded in a low whisper. Ilara instantly pressed herself deep into the leather chair. She pulled the gray blanket up over her mouth. Arthur moved toward his heavy leather belt resting on a chair. He drew his longsword without making a single sound. The polished steel gleamed deadly in the firelight. The iron handle of the study door slowly began to turn. Someone had oiled the hinges. The heavy wood opened with unnatural silence. 4 figures stepped into the dimly lit study. They wore dark leather armor and black cloaks. They held curved daggers coated in dark poison. Malachor had promised them a fortune in gold to end the king's life tonight. They expected to find Arthur asleep or drunk by the fire. They did not expect to find the sovereign standing in the center of the room. Arthur did not shout for the guards. He knew his guards were already dead in the hallway. He simply raised his sword. The assassins spread out like hunting wolves. They moved fast and low to the ground. The first man lunged forward with his poisoned blade. He aimed for Arthur's unprotected ribs. Arthur stepped inside to guide with terrifying speed. He did not swing the long edge of his sword. He drove the heavy steel pommel directly into the man's temple. Bone fractured with a dull, heavy thud. The assassin dropped to the floorboards and did not move again. The second killer lunged from the left flank. Arthur pivoted on his heel. He brought the flat of his blade down across the man's collarbone. The impact sounded like a falling tree branch. The assassin collapsed in a heap of broken limbs. The remaining 2 men hesitated. They realized they were not fighting a spoiled noble. They were fighting the most dangerous warlord in the realm. The leader of the assassins noticed the girl cowering in the leather chair. He saw an easy target. He threw his curved dagger directly at Ilara. Arthur moved faster than human eyes could track. He intercepted the flying blade with the edge of his sword. The steel rang out with a sharp chime. The poisoned dagger spun harmlessly into the stone fireplace. The fire hissed as the metal hit the hot coals. Arthur's eyes turned into black, malevolent pits. He crossed the distance to the leader in 2 massive strides.
The assassin tried to raise his arms to defend himself. Arthur grabbed the man by his leather throat. He lifted the assassin clean off the wooden floorboards with one hand. He slammed him backward against the heavy stone wall. The breath left the assassin's lungs in a violent rush. Arthur squeezed his thick fingers. "Retribution belongs to the crown," Arthur whispered. He dropped the unconscious man onto the floor. The final assassin threw down his weapon and fell to his knees. He raised his hands in absolute terror. "Mercy, sire," the man begged. Arthur stared down at the trembling killer. "Tell me who paid you," Arthur demanded. The man swallowed hard. "Lord Malachor," he confessed quickly. "He gave us gold from his hidden vaults to bribe the dungeon guards. He said you were weak and distracted by a peasant girl." Arthur looked back at Ilara. She was curled tightly in the chair. She was terrified, but she was entirely unharmed. The gray blanket was pristine and untouched by the violence. Arthur looked back at the kneeling assassin. He raised the hilt of his sword. He brought it down hard on the back of the man's neck. The killer slumped forward into the shadows. The study was quiet once again. Forfen lay broken on the floorboards.
Arthur wiped the clean blade of his sword on a dark cloth. He sheathed the weapon with a sharp click. He walked over to Ilara. He knelt in front of her chair. "Are you hurt?" he asked softly. Ilara shook her head slowly. She loosened her white-knuckled grip on the gray wool. "You saved me," she whispered. Arthur reached out and gently smoothed a crease in the blanket. "I told you nobody would ever touch you again." He stood up and looked at the unconscious men scattered across his study. He walked to the heavy oak door and stepped into the hallway. The bodies of his loyal guards lay near the entrance. Arthur stepped over them and walked to the main staircase. "Guards!" he roared. His voice echoed through the stone corridors like thunder. It woke the entire eastern wing of the castle. Dozens of armored men rushed up the stairs with torches and spears. They stopped atop the landing and awaited his command. Arthur stood before them like a god of war. His white linen tunic was spotless. "Clear the trash from my study," he ordered. "Throw them in the deepest pit you can find." The captain of the guard bowed low. "At once, Your Grace." Arthur pointed a finger toward the lower levels. "Drag Malachor out of his cell and bring him to the courtyard. Do not let him dress. Drag him by his hair if you must." The captain swallowed nervously. "The sun has not yet risen, sire." Arthur's eyes promised endless violence. "The sun does not need to rise for an execution. Wake the rest of the court. Tell the nobles to assemble in the courtyard immediately. I want them to see what happens when they send rats into my chambers." Arthur turned his back on the soldiers. He walked back into the warm study. He ignored the guards dragging the broken assassins away. He walked to the hearth and placed another heavy log on the fire. He pulled his wooden stool next to Ilara's chair. He sat down and rested his hands on his knees. Ilara looked at his calm face. The monster who had just destroyed 4 men was gone. The man sitting beside her was just Arthur again. "You are going to kill Lord Malachor," she said softly. Arthur nodded slowly. "He sent armed men into the room where you were sleeping. He threatened the only peace I have found in years." He looked at the gray wool wrapped around her shoulders. "Tomorrow the entire kingdom will learn a new lesson. They will learn that the life of a kitchen servant is worth more than the blood of a lord." He reached out and gently touched her hand. Her fingers were warm and steady. "Rest now, Ilara. The cold will not touch you ever again." Arthur sat beside her and kept watch until the dawn broke over the castle. The sky over the capital was a bruised shade of violet before dawn. Cold wind whipped through the stone arches of the royal courtyard. Hundreds of torches flickered, casting nervous, long shadows against the snow-dusted ground. Noble lords and ladies stood in tight clusters, shivering beneath their expensive velvet cloaks. They whispered frantically among themselves,
their breaths forming white clouds in the bitter morning air. A heavy silence fell over the gathered court as the inner doors of the keep groaned open. Arthur stepped onto the balcony overlooking the courtyard. He did not wear his ceremonial armor or his crown. He wore a dark wool tunic and a heavy fur-lined cloak that reached his boots. Beside him, moving with a steady, cautious gait, walked a small figure. Alara clung to his side, the gray knitted blanket wrapped snugly around her thin frame. The contrast between the towering, scarred king and the frail, limping girl held the entire court in a paralyzed trance. Arthur descended the wide stone steps, his hand resting firmly on the small of Alara's back. He led her to the center of the courtyard where a wooden platform had been hastily erected. Lord Malachor lay bound in the center of the frosted stone, his clothes torn and his face a mask of dried blood. The fallen advisor looked up at the approaching king, his eyes darting toward the noble families in search of an ally. Not a single soul moved to help him. Arthur stopped before the prisoner, his expression as cold and unyielding as the winter ice surrounding them. He gestured for the captain of the guard to stand aside. "Last night, 4 assassins entered my private study with the intent to claim my life," Arthur announced to the silent court. His voice carried across the frozen yard, deep and resonant like the tolling of a heavy bell. They acted under the direct instruction of the man currently kneeling in the dirt. He gestured toward the trembling Malachor with a gloved hand. The nobleman tried to scramble to his feet, his chains rattling sharply in the sudden quiet. "They are lying, sire," Malachor rasped, his voice thick with pain and desperation. "He claims I would betray the crown, but look at him. He is bewitched by a common kitchen rat who feeds him pathetic lies and poisons his mind." A gasp rippled through the gathered crowd. Arthur turned his gaze toward the nobles, his dark eyes scanning their pale, terrified faces. He moved toward Alara and placed his hand gently on her shoulder, effectively shielding her from their judging stares. "This woman is no rat," Arthur declared. "She is the person who reminded me of my humanity when I had forgotten it entirely." He reached out and smoothed the gray wool of the blanket on her shoulder, a gesture so tender it stunned the watching crowd. "She is my ward, and any tongue that speaks against her speaks against the throne itself." Malachor shrieked with manic, hysterical laughter, his eyes bulging as he stared at the pair. "You sacrificed the stability of a kingdom for a crippled girl who cannot even walk without a limp. The nobility will never bow to a peasant queen." Arthur stepped over the broken man, his shadow falling over Malachor like a funeral shroud. "I do not require the permission of cowards to define my own court." He drew his long sword, the steel singing a high, mournful note in the frigid morning air. Malachor's face went white, his arrogance finally collapsing into primal, naked terror. "Wait, Arthur. Let us negotiate." The sword descended in a clean, swift arc, cutting off the plea before it could fully leave his throat. Arthur stood upright, the blade steady in his grip, his eyes reflecting nothing but the cold morning light. He did not look at the body as the guards dragged the remnants of the fallen lord away across the stones. He turned toward the shocked nobles who remained frozen in place, their faces drawn and pale. "Return to your estates," Arthur commanded, his tone devoid of any room for argument. "Review your ledgers and ensure your oaths of loyalty are written in truth, not just in ink." The court dispersed within minutes, the nobles hurrying toward their carriages with frantic, terrified speed. They wanted only to distance themselves from the blood now staining the royal courtyard. Arthur stood alone with Alara amidst the swirling snow. The adrenaline of the execution faded, leaving him with a strange, quiet clarity. He took the hood of his cloak and pulled it up over Alara's head to protect her from the biting gale. "Are you cold?" he asked,
his voice returning to the gentle tone he reserved only for her. Alara shook her head, clutching the edges of the gray blanket with her soft fingers. "I am not afraid anymore," she answered. She looked at the empty spot where Malachor had just been, then back up at Arthur. "You did not have to do this for me." Arthur placed his hand over hers, his palm covering her knuckles with a protective warmth. "I did not do it for you," he said, meeting her gaze with total sincerity. "I did it for myself." He guided her back toward the heavy wooden doors of the keep. The sun finally began to crest over the jagged peaks of the northern mountains. It cast a golden light over the castle walls, turning the frost into millions of tiny, glittering diamonds. Arthur watched the light catch the gray wool of the blanket. It was no longer just a piece of yarn salvaged from a dying mother's hands. It had become a banner of his new life. He knew the path ahead would be treacherous and filled with political backlash. His nobles would whisper, and his rivals would plot, but none of it mattered. He had removed the rot from his court and placed his future in hands that knew how to mend what was broken. They passed through the grand entrance, leaving the cold courtyard behind them. The warmth of the keep greeted them, smelling of pine wood and hearth fires. Arthur did not head toward the throne room or the council chamber. He walked toward the upper levels, toward the quiet peace of the library. He needed to teach her how to read the ancient records of his house. He needed to show her the world she was now entitled to see. He would build her a life that transcended the dark kitchens and the damp cellars of her past. He would give her the strength to stand tall beside him, even if she had to lean on his arm. They climbed the stone stairs together, two figures bound by a simple piece of gray wool. The iron clatter of the guards faded behind them into a dull, rhythmic echo. Alara felt the weight of the blanket on her shoulders. She felt the strength of the king's hand holding hers. The long winter of her life had finally come to an end. She took a deep breath, the air clean and sharp in her lungs. For the first time since she was a child, she did not look at the floor. She looked ahead, toward the warm light waiting at the top of the stairs. Spring arrived with a hesitant, pale light that leapt across the castle ramparts. The winter's deep freeze finally began to surrender to the warmth of the rising sun. Alara adjusted to her new life in the upper suites with a quiet, persistent grace. She no longer wore the coarse gray rags that had once defined her existence in the lower levels. Fine silks and sturdy wools replaced the itchy fabric, though she still preferred the comfort of the gray blanket draped over her knees. Arthur had ordered a team of architects to renovate the West Wing, ensuring that the floors were even and the staircases were equipped with smooth wooden railings to aid her movement. The sunlight flooded her new chamber, illuminating the stacks of historical texts that Arthur brought her every evening. She learned the history of the realm not as a servant, but as a student of the crown. The nobles whispered behind their hands in the hallways, but their voices fell silent the moment Arthur's shadow appeared in the corridor. He had systematically removed every advisor and official who had profited from the suffering of the lower classes. The halls of the castle were quieter, cleaner, and filled with a sense of order that had been absent for decades. One evening, a massive storm battered the mountain peaks, sending rain lashing against the tall windows of the study. Arthur sat in his high-backed chair, watching the fire play across the stone walls while Alara sat nearby, her fingers tracing the faded ink of an old map. He looked at her and felt a sense of relief that felt almost entirely alien to his hardened heart. He had spent his life preparing for conflict, yet he found his true strength in this quiet room. "I have decided to rebuild the Southern Infirmary," he said, his voice breaking the soft patter of the rain. "It will be a place where the people of the city can find care regardless of their status." Alara looked up from the map, her eyes glowing with a newfound brightness. "That will change everything for them," she said.
No more will they be left to wither in the damp streets when the fever takes hold. Arthur moved his stool closer to her, resting his arms on the edge of the desk. It was your idea, when you told me about the women in the laundry rooms who had nowhere to go when they fell ill. He paused, then reached out to touch the gray blanket that lay across her lap. You have made this kingdom a place I can actually recognize as home, not just a battlefield. Alara folded the map and moved the blanket so that it covered the space between them on the wooden surface. It is a strange thing, isn't it? She smoothed the gray wool, tracing the stitches that were once so clumsy. We started with a piece of wool, and now we are talking about changing the law of the land. Arthur leaned back, his gaze fixed on the dancing embers of the fire. I was afraid of the quiet for so long, because silence always meant that an enemy was waiting to strike. He looked at her, his expression softening into something he had never dared to show his generals. Now, I look forward to the silence because I know you are here. The firelight cast long, golden reflections in her eyes as she listened to his admission. She reached out and rested her hand over his, her palm calloused but steady against his scarred skin. You spent so long fighting for a throne that you forgot the ground you were standing on, she whispered. I am not an enemy, and I am not a prize to be won. She squeezed his hand, her grip firm and resolute. I am simply the person who will be here when the battles are finally over. Arthur sighed, a sound that carried the weariness of 1,000 miles of marching and a lifetime of iron discipline. The world outside still expects me to be the storm, he said. They want me to be the king who burns the forest to catch a single thief. Alara shook her head, a soft, knowing smile playing on her lips. Let them expect what they want. You are the one who chooses what you become when the door is locked. Arthur turned his hand over and interlaced his fingers with hers. The gray blanket felt warm between them, a tangible reminder of the day they had first met in this very room. It had survived the winter, the assassins, and the political firestorms of the court. It had become a symbol of a promise that went far beyond the simple act of knitting. I want to finish the matching set, she said suddenly, breaking the intensity of the moment with a practical thought. If we have a longer blanket, it will cover both of us when the autumn winds arrive. Arthur laughed, the sound genuine and unforced, echoing through the high ceilings of the library. You have spent all your life working for others, he said. Now you are worried about the draft in the room. Alara pulled the wool closer, her movements fluid and sure. I am worried about my king getting a chill while he plans his new infirmaries. Arthur stood up, walked to the hearth, and stirred the fire until the logs sparked and roared with renewed life. He felt the weight of the crown shifting, transforming from a burden of duty into a tool for genuine change. He looked at the woman sitting in his chair, the woman who had transformed from a broken servant into the architect of his better nature.
The storm continued to howl outside, but inside, the room was a fortress of quiet warmth. He walked back to his stool, pulling it as close to her as he could. Start the next row, he commanded playfully. I have spent the day signing treaties, and my hands are tired of the pen. Alara picked up the needles, her hands moving with the confidence of someone who had found their true purpose. The clicking of the wood against wood resumed, a steady, soothing heartbeat in the center of the dark castle. The history of the kingdom would record his wars and his decrees, but it would never know about the gray wool. It would never understand that the most powerful king in the world had been taught his greatest lesson by a girl from the kitchens. Arthur watched the yarn loop and knot, his mind finally at peace. He was no longer waiting for the next war. He was simply waiting for the next row to be finished. The darkness of his past had been sewn shut, hidden beneath the gray threads of a new beginning. He closed his eyes and leaned back, letting the rhythmic sound lull him into the first restful sleep he had known in years. Ilara continued to knit, her gaze steady, her heart full, as she wove their fates together in the golden light of the hearth. The heavy iron gates of the capital were thrown wide open as the first buds of spring began to appear on the mountain slopes. The kingdom breathed a collective sigh of relief, the atmosphere of dread and suspicion having evaporated like mist under the rising sun. Arthur stood on the wide stone terrace, his hands resting on the cool parapet as he overlooked the bustling market squares below. The streets were no longer filled with the heavy patrols of armored guards, but with traders, children playing in the sun, and families gathering for the spring festivals. He felt a soft warmth against his side as Ilara stepped out onto the terrace to join him, her stride steady and strong. She had abandoned the limp that once defined her physical existence, moving with the quiet confidence of a woman who owned her own destiny. Her hands, once raw with chilblains and covered in ash, were now adorned with simple silver rings that Arthur had commissioned from the city's finest smiths. She held the gray wool blanket folded neatly over her arm, a relic of their shared journey that had evolved into a symbol of their collective endurance. Arthur looked down at the city and then back to the woman who had transformed his reign. He had spent the final months of the season working with the Council of Ministers to rewrite the statutes of the realm. The cruel taxes that had driven families into the deep cellars of the slums were abolished in favor of a fair distribution of the kingdom's silver. New clinics had been constructed where the infirm and the elderly could receive care without the demand for coin or status. It was not a paradise, but it was a place where human dignity was no longer treated as a luxury for the wealthy. Arthur turned to face her, his dark eyes reflecting the clarity of the spring sky. "I remember standing on this terrace after the Northern War," he said, his voice quiet but filled with a profound sense of purpose. "I felt like the absolute master of a graveyard, believing that strength meant standing alone against the weight of the entire world." Ilara smiled, reaching out to tuck a stray lock of hair behind his ear, her touch light and familiar. "You were a man who was afraid to lose his crown," she replied, noting the way his face had relaxed into a softer, more approachable expression. "Now you are a man who understands that a crown is only as valuable as the people it serves." Arthur took her hand, interlacing his fingers with hers as they turned back toward the lush, budding gardens of the inner courtyard. He guided her toward a small patch of soil where they had prepared a space to plant a young oak tree. It was a tradition of his house to mark the end of a great era, but he had chosen this particular spot to mark the beginning of their own. They knelt together on the soft grass, the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine rising into the air around them. The gardener waited nearby, but Arthur waved him off, preferring to drive the shovel into the ground with his own hands. Ilara knelt beside him, her fingers digging into the rich, dark soil as she helped him cradle the delicate roots of the sapling. They packed the dirt around the base, their hands working in tandem with the same rhythm they had once used to knit rows of wool. When they stood up, Arthur wiped the dirt from his hands onto his trousers, ignoring the scandalized looks of a passing valet. "This tree will grow long after we are gone," Arthur said, his eyes fixed on the grown leaves that shimmered in the breeze. "It will be a witness to the fact that we were here, and that we did something better than wage war." Ilara watched the branches sway, her heart full with the realization that the shadows of her past were finally, permanently gone. She no longer felt the phantom aches of her broken leg, or the cold bite of the winter wind that used to haunt her nights. She was no longer the servant girl, and he was no longer the cruel alpha king of the legends. They were two souls who had saved each other from the abyss. They walked slowly back into the keep, the stone walls feeling less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. In the grand hall, Arthur paused before a polished display case that stood near the entrance to the royal chambers. He opened the glass door and placed the gray blanket inside, smoothing the fabric one final time with a look of reverence. It would remain there for all time, a reminder to the future lords of the land that the greatest strength is found in kindness. He closed the glass, the lock clicking into place with a sound that felt like the final period on a long, arduous book. He looked at Ilara, who stood beside him, her gaze reflecting the same peace that had finally settled over his own heart. The challenges of the future were still waiting, but they would face them not as a king and a servant, but as partners. Arthur held out his arm, a silent invitation that she accepted without a moment of hesitation. They ascended the grand staircase toward the library, the light of the setting sun casting long, golden bars of warmth across the stone floors. He had no more need for the cold detachment of a warlord, and she had no more mold for the invisibility of the neglected. They were building a world that was worthy of their shared story, a world where the weak were protected and the strong were gentle. As they reached the top of the stairs, Arthur glanced back once at the empty halls of the castle. He saw the echoes of who he had been, but he did not regret them, for they had led him to this exact moment. He pulled the doors to the library open, the room filled with the scent of old parchment and fresh, sweet air. Ilara stepped inside, her movements fluid and elegant, a light in her eyes that outshone the fading sun. Arthur followed her in, closing the door firmly behind them, shutting out the demands of the world. There were no more wars to win, no more assassins to fear, and no more storms to survive. There was only the quiet promise of the years ahead and the deep, abiding certainty that they were exactly where they were meant to be. He crossed the room to join her, their paths converging at the center of the world they had built together. The gray wool was folded safely in the cabinet downstairs, but the warmth it represented was woven into the fabric of their lives. Arthur sat in his chair, and Ilara sat beside him, the silence between them no longer heavy, but vibrant with potential. The kingdom hummed with life below them, a thriving garden that they had helped to plant and nurture. It was a story that would be whispered in the halls for generations, a legend of a king who learned to knit and a girl who learned to fly. But for them, it was simply life, simple and good and beautiful, unfolding one stitch at a time in the quiet heart of the mountain. Arthur looked at his hands, those same hands that had broken armies, and realized they were finally steady. He looked at Ilara and realized that in the end, love was the only conquest that truly mattered. The sun disappeared behind the peaks, leaving the castle bathed in a soft twilight glow that signaled the start of a long-awaited rest. They sat together as the stars began to appear, the keepers of the peace, the architects of the future, and the guardians of a love that was written in the gray wool of the past.
Sometimes, the strongest armor we wear is the kindness we show to others. This story reminded me that even a king needs a reason to put down his sword and heal. If this touched your heart, please subscribe to join our community. I'm truly curious, where in the world are you watching from today? Leave your footprint in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And please, share what moment moved you the most. I read every single thought.